What's good, y'all? My name is Darius, and I'm back with more of my series, The 101. In my previous video, I explained the various parts of your orbiter, your dropship, and some of the consoles that you will frequent when you're up here, which is your marketplace, navigation, codex, the conclave itself, including the syndicates, and down here where you have the forge, your companions, your relics, your arsenal, and your mods. Now, this video, I'm going to explain the titular weapons that you will be using during the duration of the game itself, which of course is called Warframe. And as usual, if you guys like the video, be sure to subscribe, like, and hit the bell, and you will get updates to the game in its entirety. With all that being said, let's get into it. Anyway, the titular weapons, or warframes, are pretty much like the suits of the game. Think of Iron Man, where he has various suits that has different abilities, and they're not the same no matter how many Iron Man suits you come across. But the obvious thing is that the Iron Man suits themselves are capable of flight. In this particular case, you have various warframes. Each of them have abilities that can range from magnetism to fire to wind in its entirety to ice, including speed itself. Now, I'm going to explain some of the first warframes you will come across. And since I have them, I can explain them in more detail. When you first begin playing the game, you'll have access to one of three warframes. You'll have access to Excalibur, which is the beginning warframe. You have access to... where is she? You have access to Meg. And you have access to... where is he? Here he is. You have access to Volt. Each warframe in this game has their own strength and weakness. And each warframe has abilities that matches the warframe in question. For example, Volt's abilities all deal with electricity, which is obvious by his abilities, which is shock, speed, electric shield, and discharge. You can pretty much guess which type of warframe is what just by the name of them. But it goes into much more detail than that, as some warframes have names that don't really mesh with what they do. And it does get a bit more confusing. But for now, I'm going to begin explaining the first warframe that you will more than likely see more often, which is Excalibur. Now, Excalibur in its entirety is a pretty decent warframe, pretty well rounded, and he's pretty decent in most different aspects. And just like Excalibur, all of his abilities get stronger when he uses bladed style weapons, which is denoted by his passive. Anyway, and as I explain different things, I'm going to explain which each ability, well, I'm going to explain right now now is a good time as any, but each warframe has 4 different abilities. You unlock the abilities as you rank the warframe up, and within those ranks, each warframe has rank ups for different types of abilities they have. So for example, at rank 1, you're going to, rank 0 or unranked, depending on how you like to look at it, each warframe will start off with their first ability. In Excalibur's ability, the first ability you have is called Slash Dash. You can also, and like in the last video, you can mouse over the ability to see a sort of demo of the ability in its entirety. Now, to go a bit deeper into the warframe's abilities in its entirety, for me, I like to categorize warframe abilities into 4 different types. The first type is attack, second type is defense, third type is support, and the fourth type is utility. You may call it something different, but for me, I like to refer to these 4 different types of abilities as is. 4 different types of attacks. Attack and defense are pretty self-explanatory. For attack, you have abilities that deal damage to enemies that can that can pretty much chunk out enemies and delete their health bar, basically. Defense type abilities is abilities that defend you from different attacks, such as Frost's Snow Globe or Gara's Mirrors. Support abilities are abilities that can buff or heal your allies, or can bestow various damage resistances to your allies as well. Now, utility is sort of the wild card, as utility could be anything. To me, utility is more or less about debuffing enemies and having abilities that can get you from A to B. Now, what I mean by that is utility abilities could be seen as debuffs or travel style abilities that can get you further depending on where you're facing. For example, for me, Slash Dash is considered a attack and utility ability, as some frames may have two types of abilities mixed into one ability. The reason why this is an attack ability is because it deals damage to enemies directly by dashing between enemies while slashing with Exalted Blade. But it's utility because you actually dash forward, which is sort of a movement style in itself, which helps, especially when it attacks in front of you and you move forward. Like in this case, the range for it is 12 meters, which is pretty good as you can cover a lot more ground. It's also good because you're actually invincible when you use Slash Dash, which is a sort of get out of jail free card, if you will. Radio Blind. Emits a bright flash of light, blinding all enemies in a small radius for several seconds. Radio Blind is pretty unique because you can actually assassinate enemies while it's up. So, the radius for it is 25 meters, which is really good, and it lasts 15 seconds. So, Radio Blind would be considered I'd say it would be considered a utility ability as well, as it debuffs enemies such as blinds them so that they can't attack you at all. Radio Javelin. Launches javelins towards enemies, dealing high damage and impaling them to walls. The radius for it is 12 meters. Its damage, which could be slash, impact, or puncture, 800, and the number of javelins is 10. Now, I'm going to go into detail with the core damage types in pretty much in the next video, so keep an eye out for that one. Anyway, Radio Javelin is exactly what it does. If enemies are around you, this is pretty much an attack style ability. If you're surrounded by a ton of enemies, it pretty much, I mean, the actual demo is pretty much doing a good job of that. But anyway, Radio Javelin basically attacks any enemies all around you, in front of you, or anywhere within your vicinity. The radius is also wide, as any enemies caught within range are pretty much immediately dead, basically. Which is also good, especially after you use Radio Blind. But again, it's a pretty straightforward ability. Exalted Blade. Summon a sort of pure light and immense power. Now, the damage for this one it deals is cut, impact, and puncture, which is 200, blind radius, which is 5 meters, and the blind duration is 6 seconds. So you can kind of consider this a cross between Radio Blind and Slash Dash, minus the travel power. But the thing about Exalted Blade is that it's called a sustain ability. And it's called sustain because the ability itself will constantly tick your energy down by 2.5 every second. So what that means is that as long as you have the ability up, you can continue doing what the person in the demo is doing. On top of that, Exalted Blade sends out a wave of energy which can cut down multiple enemies at once. Which means if there are enemies behind, they're also taking damage as well. Now, the thing about Excalibur for his passive is that he deals 10% increased damage and attacks 10% faster when wielding swords. Which is why. So, Excalibur actually is the name of King Arthur's sword, which pretty much gives itself away. So whenever you look at King Arthur or anything like that and his sword Excalibur, you could pretty much tell that Excalibur himself right here gets much more damage when he's wielding swords, and he's much faster with it. So basically, the entire idea and the entire playstyle around Excalibur is going to be using swords. And as usual, you got the tips over here. As I'm not going to go through too many of them, as I want to, speed this along. For the first tip, Excalibur is immune to damage for the duration of Slash Dash. Basically, which I explained before. Radio Blind can temporarily deactivate laser barriers and security cameras. Basically, Blind can essentially disable, anything that's robotic in its entirety. So basically, if you use Radio Blind on sensors or, of course, laser barriers or security cameras, it literally shuts it off for a small period of time. You can kind of consider this the EMP of the game, basically. But again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, as I just want to, move this along. But that's Excalibur in its entirety. He's pretty decent all around, especially when you first start playing a game. He has decent shield, decent health, high armor, and he has enough energy to match it all. So Excalibur is again the middle ground frame, and you want to make sure that you give Excalibur enough decent mods to help make him whichever you want him to be, because he's pretty decent at support as well. Anyway, on the mag. Now, mag in its entirety is a different type of Warframe, because Mag herself is the Warframe of magnetism, and all her abilities deal with pulling enemies closer, crushing them, stealing their shields, or making enemies shoot them due to magnetize. Now, she's a bit of a wild card, and believe it or not, I actually do like using her, and I do like her abilities and whatnot. Since her abilities depend on magnetism, enemies will constantly be getting tripped over. They'll be falling to the ground due to pull. They'll also be crushed, as they'll be pretty much magnetized in their entirety, and you can pretty much finish them off. To me, Mag is more like a crowd control style frame, which brings out her full potential. You can kind of consider her either the support or the, how should I say, one of the more glass cannon style frames. Anyway, let's get into her abilities. Actually, as a matter of fact, let's look at her passive. Bullet jumping pulls in nearby items for easy collection. So the thing about her ability is that bullet jump is a sort of basic skill where if you slide across the ground and press the jump button, you'll spin through the air. And when you spin through the air, you'll pull items to you. This is good, especially if you're farming and you have a certain sentinel that's capable of pulling in resources as well. So that's great for farming missions, especially when you're out of range of certain items. If they fall off the map and whatnot, you can pull them back to you immediately. So she's actually pretty good for doing farming missions. So anyway, on to her abilities. Pull. Magnetic force pulls enemies towards you, stunning them and bringing them into melee range. This is a pretty decent ability because if enemies are behind cover, or if enemies are behind cover, you can pull them out of cover and drag them to you, and while they're down, you can assassinate them for an easy kill. You can also if you pull enemies, you'll also have a 25% chance of them dropping certain items, such as either health, energy orbs, or ammo themselves. Magnetize. Now, magnetize is different because you have a tap option and a hold option. The tap option encloses a target in a magnetic field, ensnaring nearby enemies and dealing damage over time. Bullets and shards created from polarized increase this damage. So basically, if you magnetize an enemy, you can actually, well, the enemies themselves will take friendly fire damage and damage themselves from different abilities as well. So energy weapons, solid type weapons, they'll all converge onto the enemy themselves. Hold. Creates a magnetic field around Mag, absorbing ranged attacks and dealing damage back in a destructive cone. So this one's a bit different, as it's more about Mag herself. So she absorbs range attacks, and when it deals enough damage, and when it ends, you could deal pretty much a destructive cone of damage. Originally, this was just an ability that just affected enemies, but it no longer does that, as it has two different options now. Polarize. Emit an energy pulse that depletes enemy shields and armor, creating shards which become deadly when mixed with magnetize. Shields of allies touched by the pulse are restored. Now, this is where her support ability comes into play. Whenever she emits a pulse, it depletes the enemy shields, and basically it restores your allies' shields as well. So it sort of creates pickups on the ground that if any allies come in range, their shields is automatically restored, which is actually great. And it's increased further when you use Magnetize, which is great. Because if you use Polarize first and then use Magnetize, you'll pretty much increase the damage of Polarize as well. So there's that. Crush. Magnetizes the bones of nearby enemies, causing them to collapse upon themselves. Now, this unique ability is Mag's ultimate. Her ultimate catches any enemy within range and pretty much destroys them instantly. So every time they're within in her crush ability, they basically get hit with 25 damage, but it actually does a lot of damage in its entirety. Plus, any enemies caught within crush, they basically held still and are sitting ducks. And if they survive, they're pretty. I believe they're under the effects of Polarize, I believe. But yeah, those are her abilities. And again, we're only going to go through a couple of tips for Mag as well. Kill enemies with pull to increase the chances of an energy orb dropping. Again, which I explained before. Since pull has a 25% chance to increase, well, it has a 25% chance to drop any sort of energy orb, ammo, or health orb. So basically, you want to pull often because it has a 1 in 4 chance of dropping something. Cast Polarize to strip enemy armor and shields before casting Crush for more effective destruction. Again, which is why if you cast Polarize and then put Crush, you can pretty much end any enemy in their entirety without having to worry about it much. But yeah, Mag in her entirety is a pretty decent Warframe, especially when used correctly. Although her armor is a little under par, she also has the highest shields. Yeah, she also has the highest shields in the game as well. She's also one Warframe that has high energy as well. I say the only real downside is that although her abilities do bounce off one another, unless you have mods for those abilities, you won't get as much mileage out of her as you may think. Since the best thing to use for her would be magnet damage, especially if enemies are under magnet damage, you deal increased damage to them overall, which increases the damage she deal with any one of her abilities from pull, magnetize, polarize, or crush. But all in all, I do enjoy playing as her, especially her prime variant, which has increased stats as well, which I began to play with quite a lot, as Mag Prime is the very first prime variant I've ever created. So yeah, that's Mag. Now the third and final Warframe, which is Volt. Although Volt has the same stats as she does, he actually starts off with above average shield and health. although he has, more energy, he has the same amount of armor. But as the game says, he has an alternative. He's an alternative to natural gunplay since his abilities all deal with electricity or lightning in its entirety. Now we're gonna go into his abilities. The thing about Volt is that he has a passive that's unique to him. That, as a matter of fact, I'll just let you see. Grounded movement generates an electrical charge building up to 5 damage per meter that is unleashed with the next attack. Now, the thing about Volt is that his abilities all come from him and ground combat. The thing about ground combat is that in the upper right hand corner of your screen, next to your Warframe and their health and shields, you will see this number build up. The higher the number build up, the more damage Volt deals with any source of damage. It could be anything from his abilities to the weapons he used, even melee attacks. Now, the thing about Volt is that when you use certain abilities and when you shoot weapons, it immediately uses that charge. So basically, when using Volt, you have to be more patient in your approach with his abilities and what type of weapons you give him as well. Which is why when he has grounded, which means his grounded abilities can go up to, I believe, 1,000, and it doesn't go any higher than that. So every meter he runs, every meter he runs when he's on the ground, not in the air, when he's on the ground, he gets 1 point. He gets 1 point. So if he goes 5 meters, that's immediately 5 points. So basically, if you have build up to the absolute max, you can deal up to a max of 5,000 damage. Since every meter you go builds up 5 damage every time. So basically, you want to be careful in how you use his abilities and how you use weapons around him, because you may be dealing lower weapon damage or lower ability damage overall. So anyway, enough of that. Let's get to his abilities. Shock. Haunches a shock and projectile. It stuns and deals high damage to a single target and chains damage to nearby enemies. Now, shock is unique because as you rank the ability up, you'll be able to chain lightning to different enemies. So this is great as a crowd control ability since if you have mods that increases how much energy he has, you can use it more often. And if you use energy efficiency mods, it will cost less to cast, and you can pretty much use your abilities as much as you want. But again, your abilities all come from your actual passive, which increases when you're on the ground. So if you're bullet jumping through the air, you won't get no charge. You have to be on the ground, which is, grounded. Speed. Gain a brief boost of speed, brief boost of movement speed, which affects all allies with range. This is one of his support abilities. This increases how fast a Warframe goes. You can use different mods to extend the duration, the radius, and you can have different types of multipliers attached to it. Now, the reason why the speed multiplier matters is that if you increase the speed multiplier, you go faster. And if you increase the radius, you'll affect more of your teammates. Plus, you can also consider a sort of get out of jail free card. So you have increased everything, which means you have increased movement speed, you have increased fire rate, etc. So this is good for when you want to mag dump different enemies. But yeah, speed is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go into too much detail with that. Electric shield. Volt deploys an obstacle of energy, providing cover in any situation. Now, the thing about electric shield is that this is the defensive option in the game. But the unique thing about the electric shield is that you can shoot through it, and it will gain the electricity buff. Which means that if Volt puts an energy shield down, every shot fired through the shield in its entirety will give off electric damage, which will stun enemies. which in the next video I'll explain different. Yeah, I'll explain the different. I'll explain the different damage types. Anyway, electric shield is pretty self-explanatory since it blocks any incoming damage, and it doesn't run down until it doesn't have a health duration like how some other abilities do, as its duration lasts for as long as however many seconds it lasts. Discharge. Paralyze nearby hostiles with a damaging electric charge. This also shocks approaching enemies. Now, this is Volt's ultimate ability. The thing about Discharge is that it deals great damage in a huge radius, and of course, any enemy after you shock them is pretty much stunned for the duration, which you can use to clean them up. And since the duration only lasts a few seconds, mods that increase the duration is a whole lot better. So that's pretty much Discharge. The tips for him is cast speed to cover distance quickly and rapidly build damage for Volt's passive. One thing to note is that abilities in this game do stack. So if you use a certain Warframe, such as Gauss for his speed, you can cast speed and Gauss will be the fastest thing on the planet. Especially if you use Gauss's ultimate ability, which is Redline, which means Gauss is just speeding across everywhere. He can get from A to B extremely fast. Cast Shock on priority targets to temporarily stun them and open an opportunity for attack. Like usual, when you cast Shock, enemies are stunned like how they are right now. And when enemies are stunned, you can pretty much take your time and take down an enemy for as long as the ability you have lasts. So when the ability duration lasts, it frees up attacks and you can pretty much chop down any target in a matter of seconds. But yeah, in summary, Volt is a pretty decent Warframe, especially when you give him a bunch of mods that increases his attack power. Plus he has a lot of AoE moves, which means he's also great for crowd control. He's alright for defense, and he's alright for support. But again, just like Mag, he has below average armor, which means he's kind of squishy. But he does start off with above average health, and I believe above average shields as well. But other than that, those are the three basic Warframes in the game. There are more Warframes in the game, as each Warframe has different specialties and different abilities, and there's pretty much a Warframe for everybody. So all in all, each Warframe has their own strength and weakness, and each frame does exactly what it does in their entirety. And each Warframe has a different role they can play within the team. Anyway, that's it for me. I went on long enough. So as usual, if you guys like the video, or if there's anything I can work on, be sure to leave a comment, subscribe, like the video, or you can follow any of my socials, which is down in the description below. Anyway, that's all for me, and I'll catch you guys later.